Commitment anchors reality through inevitable cycles of stagnation, proving that enduring a shared plateau matters far more than chasing fleeting novelty. True dedication survives the unavoidable arrival of dullness, choosing to build depth right where excitement fades away. Staying power requires honoring the oath through every flat stretch, recognizing that lasting value emerges only after the initial spark inevitably cools down. Commitment forms the bedrock of true partnership precisely because stagnation arrives immediately in every single connection, turning the inevitable fading of initial excitement into the real test of endurance. Enduring that flat plateau demands deep dedication rather than a hasty exit, choosing to construct lasting value right where the initial spark cools down into ordinary reality. Building something meaningful means staying through the dull, predictable stretches when the novelty vanishes completely, proving that profound loyalty thrives far beyond the temporary high of early discovery. Honoring the bond requires facing those quiet, unchanging moments head-on, without running away toward the next distraction, cementing the choice to remain rooted through every predictable cycle. True partnership survives the transition from vibrant novelty to absolute stillness, anchoring both individuals in a shared space built on deliberate persistence rather than fleeting amusement. Remaining steadfast through the inevitable slowdown honors the core architecture of devotion, recognizing that real depth emerges only after the easy excitement fades into the background. Sustaining a connection through the long, flat phases requires immense internal resolve, trading the quick thrill of constant stimulation for the quiet power of steady, unchanging presence. Dedication proves its true worth precisely when the dynamic flattens out, demanding that individuals stay the course, instead of abandoning ship the moment routine sets in. Embracing the plateau transforms ordinary endurance into an act of profound devotion, showing that staying power matters infinitely more than endless novelty. Navigating the inevitable stillness together builds an unshakable foundation, proving that real commitment begins right where the excitement ends, and the long, steady work of staying put takes over completely. Commitment anchors reality through inevitable cycles of stagnation, proving that enduring a shared plateau matters far more than chasing fleeting novelty. True dedication survives the unavoidable arrival of dullness, choosing to build depth right where excitement fades away. Staying power requires honoring the oath through every flat stretch, recognizing that lasting value emerges only after the initial spark inevitably cools down. Being on the same page means recognizing that synchronization is never a permanent state of being, but rather an active, continuous choice to realign when paths inevitably drift. Knowing when you are truly aligned requires looking past superficial agreements to see if both individuals are willing to endure the exact same quiet plateaus without demanding constant external stimulation. In today's disposable society, treating human beings like interchangeable commodities undermines the very foundation of deep connection, reducing sacred bonds to disposable conveniences traded away at the first sign of friction. Discarding people the moment boredom strikes or convenience dictates destroys the capacity for genuine endurance, replacing meaningful loyalty with a revolving door of shallow interactions. Meeting more people when old bonds fray offers a seductive illusion of infinite choice, yet it ultimately traps the seeker in an endless loop of superficial beginnings that never mature into lasting depth. True partnership refuses the modern impulse toward disposability, choosing instead to stay anchored and work through the difficult phases rather than endlessly discarding companions for newer models. Measuring alignment by shared values rather than identical thoughts prevents the trap of demanding a singularity mold, allowing two distinct individuals to remain on the same page while maintaining their separate identities. Staying power in a culture of disposability acts as a radical rebellion, proving that human worth cannot be measured by utility or replaced by the next swipe on a screen. Building a life requires weathering the long, unexciting stretches together, knowing that abandoning people at the first sign of stagnation only guarantees a lifetime of superficial connections and lonely echoes. Being on the same page requires mutual willingness to face the silence, the routine, and the flat phases, without running away toward the false promise of greener pastures elsewhere. True dedication rejects the throwaway culture of modern connection, establishing deep roots that survive even when the initial excitement turns into absolute stillness. Navigating the desolate landscape of a toxic dynamic demands an entirely different framework than ordinary relational stagnation, because preserving the self in the presence of a pathological manipulator requires immediate and absolute departure rather than patient endurance. While routine plateaus and harmless boredom test the limits of ordinary dedication, dealing with an individual devoid of authentic empathy transforms the concept of loyalty into a dangerous trap that actively erodes psychological survival. Recognizing the subtle infiltration of unhealthy relational patterns requires tuning into the quiet alarms raised by intuition, identifying the relentless cycle of idealization, devaluation, and discard before it dismantles personal autonomy entirely. Staying committed to someone who weaponizes vulnerability turns the sacred act of endurance into slow self-destruction, proving that true discernment lies in knowing exactly where healthy boundaries end and destructive abuse begins. Walking away from a malignant presence is never an act of disposability or shallow convenience, but rather a profound declaration of self-respect and an absolute refusal to finance another person's emotional parasitism. In a culture where relationships are frequently treated as interchangeable commodities, drawing a hard line against psychological exploitation protects the sacred sanctity of genuine connection from being contaminated by manipulation. Being on the same page with a toxic partner is a literal impossibility, because their entire reality is constructed upon a foundation of mirrors, shifting goalposts, and manufactured crises designed to keep the other person perpetually off balance. Trying to achieve synchronization with a manipulator is like attempting to anchor a ship in a shifting desert of quicksand, where every concession made only sinks the seeker deeper into confusion and self-doubt. Recognizing the undeniable markers of psychological abuse means accepting that no amount of loyalty, patience, or shared history can ever cure a pathology that feeds entirely on the goodwill of its host. The modern impulse to discard people casually must never be confused with the vital, life-saving necessity of cutting ties with those who systematically dismantle your sense of reality. True self-preservation demands that the revolving door of disposable connections be firmly locked against anyone who brings intentional harm, ensuring that human worth is never compromised by tolerating the intolerable. Walking away from a destructive dynamic requires immense internal fortitude, stepping bravely into the unknown rather than remaining shackled to a familiar executioner disguised as a companion. Measuring the health of a connection means auditing whether the bond nurtures vitality or drains the spirit to a hollow shell, cutting away the dead weight of toxicity to make room for authentic peace. Remaining anchored in unhealthy dynamics under the false banner of eternal loyalty is a betrayal of one's own existence, trading boundless potential for the agonizing prison of constant psychological warfare. True dedication honors the sanctity of the human spirit by refusing to serve as collateral damage in someone else's emotional pathology, choosing liberation over the quiet agony of slow erasure. Navigating the aftermath of an abusive entanglement requires returning to the core architecture of the self, rebuilding boundaries with absolute precision to ensure that destructive forces can never penetrate the inner sanctuary again. Recognizing the profound difference between ordinary relational friction and malignant exploitation is the ultimate test of wisdom, separating the noble endurance of real partnership from the suicidal foolishness of staying with a predator. Breaking free shatters the invisible chains of manipulation, proving that walking away is not a failure of character, but the ultimate triumph of personal sovereignty and unyielding self-preservation. Rebuilding the inner sanctuary after escaping the gravitational pull of a pathological manipulator transforms the entire landscape of recovery, fundamentally altering how one perceives human connection and the delicate line between healthy endurance and self-preservation. Surviving the slow, calculated erosion of psychological abuse leaves deep imprints on the psyche, forcing a radical recalibration of trust that changes every subsequent interaction with the world. When you have spent years pouring your soul into an unreciprocated void, desperately trying to fix a broken dynamic under the false banner of eternal loyalty, the aftermath demands a period of intense, unsparing introspection. Recovery in this context is not merely about healing old wounds, but about constructing an impenetrable fortress of self-worth that recognizes toxicity at the absolute micro-level before it can ever take root. This profound shift in perception often triggers a pendulum swing toward extreme caution, where the instinct to discard people at the very first flicker of a red flag becomes a protective reflex rather than a casual dismissal. The lingering ghost of past manipulation whispers constant warnings, teaching the survivor to view red flags with microscopic scrutiny and to sever ties instantly rather than risk repeating the cycle of quiet agony. Walking away from questionable dynamics transforms from a difficult moral dilemma into an automatic survival mechanism, prioritizing absolute internal peace over the societal guilt of leaving someone behind. Yet this defensive reflex introduces a complex paradox into the recovery journey. blurring the crucial boundary between wise self-preservation and the cynical habit of treating human beings as entirely disposable commodities. Striking the right balance means learning to separate the normal, messy friction of authentic human relationships from the calculated, predatory red flags of a true manipulator, ensuring that the hard-won armor does not end up locking out genuine connection entirely. True healing requires developing the nuanced discernment to stay through ordinary relational plateaus without sacrificing personal boundaries, while simultaneously maintaining the fierce courage to walk away immediately when real danger appears. The recovery process asks the survivor to look past the fear of repetition, rebuilding the capacity for trust from the ground up on a foundation of unshakable self-ownership and radical self-respect. Honoring the lessons learned from toxic entanglements means recognizing that your time, energy, and emotional depth are finite, precious resources that must never again be squandered on those who offer only exploitation in return. As perception clears and the fog of psychological warfare finally lifts, the individual emerges with a crystal-clear understanding of what true partnership actually requires, knowing precisely when to invest deeply and when to walk away forever.